Welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. We take something complex and break it down for you.
That's right. Making sure you get the key ideas and come away feeling like you really learned something, without having to read a whole book or a bunch of journal articles.
Right. Who has time for all that? But hey, today's topic is a big one. What makes a good scientific explanation? And as always, you've given us the perfect starting point.
Yeah, you pointed us to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on causal explanations in science. Really gets into the philosophical nitty-gritty of it all.
So let's jump right in. We're going to act as your guides through this philosophical jungle, exploring how different thinkers have approached this question, especially in the last few decades with this focus on causal explanations.
And remember, as the learner, you're all about efficiency. You want knowledge that's sticky, different viewpoints to consider, and those satisfying aha moments without getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly. We're going to try and do just that. And we're focusing primarily on causal explanations that have been developed since the 1990s, which means we'll only briefly mention those earlier models, like the deductive nomological model, the DN model, which has its own ESEP entry if you want to go deeper.
And to keep things focused for this deep dive, we're also leaving aside the really technical stuff about causal modeling, which could be a whole other deep dive on its own.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack the core philosophical perspectives on how science answers those why and how questions, focusing on this idea of causation.
We'll be exploring three major accounts that try to get at what makes a good scientific explanation. Mechanistic explanations, the charetic account developed by Michael Strevens, and interventionist theories.
But before we even start, we should acknowledge something. There's a really interesting philosophical debate about whether all explanations that answer why or how are even causal at their core. It's something to keep in the back of our minds as we go through all of this.
Okay, so first up, mechanisms. The idea of explaining things in terms of their underlying mechanisms has a long history. You can trace it back to people like Descartes and beyond. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we saw a resurgence of this idea with a new twist.
Right, it became known as the new mechanist approach. And one of the thinkers who really set the stage for this new wave of mechanistic thinking was Wesley Salmon with his causal mechanical model, or the CM model of explanation.
Yeah, Salmon's work is really fascinating, and you can find a great discussion of it in the SAP entry on scientific explanation. But for our purposes, I think it's helpful to highlight a few key points that are relevant to understanding where the new mechanists were coming from.
Okay, shoot.
First, Salmon's CM model was a direct response to that DN model we mentioned earlier. He, and later the new mechanists, felt that the DN model, with its emphasis on laws, didn't quite capture how much of science actually works when we're trying to explain things, especially in fields like biology.
Yeah, I remember from our previous deep dive on the DN model that it really stressed this idea of deducing explanations from these universal laws. But as you said, a lot of scientific fields, especially those dealing with complex systems, don't really seem to operate with those kinds of strict universal laws.
Exactly. And like Salmon, the new mechanists also downplayed the importance of these universal laws, because they observed that in many areas of science, particularly the life sciences, those strict exceptionless laws are hard to come by. They argued that finding those laws shouldn't be the ultimate goal of science.
So if finding those laws isn't the be-all and end-all of science, then what is?
Instead of laws, the focus shifted to understanding the specific processes at play, the how of things, rather than the covering law that the DN model was so focused on. This shift marked a real departure from the DN model's way of thinking about explanation.
That makes sense. It's like shifting from a focus on the general rules to the specific mechanisms by which those rules might be implemented or instantiated in the real world.
Precisely. Now, another key point to understand about Salmon is that he argued that explanation is, as he called it, ontic.
Ontic, what does that mean?
It means that explanations are about the real physical mechanisms and structures in the world, rather than just about how we as scientists or observers represent the world. It's a contrast with epistemic views like the DN model, which focus more on the knowledge and justification of those representations, rather than the actual underlying causal structure of the world.
So for Salmon, explanations are about the actual stuff happening out there, not just the way we think about it.
Exactly. This ontic view really resonated with some of the new mechanists like Carl Craver, even though others didn't necessarily emphasize it as much.
Interesting. So we've got this shift away from laws towards mechanisms and a focus on the actual stuff in the world rather than just our ideas about it. What else?
One more important distinction that Salmon made is between what he called the etiological and constitutive aspects of an explanation.
Two big words. I'm guessing they have specific meanings in this context. Break them down for us.
Of course, the etiological aspect is about tracing the causes of an event, like a historical account of how something came to be, whereas the constitutive aspect focuses on the internal workings, the mechanism itself that brings about that event. It's about the structure of the thing and how its parts relate to one another.
So it's like the difference between explaining how a car accident happened and explaining how the internal combustion engine of a car works.
Exactly. And this focus on the constitutive aspect, how things are put together and how they interact, became a really central theme for the new mechanists. They saw the internal organization of mechanisms as key to understanding how things work in the world.
Okay, so we've got some background from Salmon. Now, who are some of the key figures in this new mechanism movement, and what did they contribute?
Well, after Salmon, the new mechanism movement really took off with important work by philosophers like William Bechtel, Robert Richardson, Stuart Glennon, and a really influential collaboration between Peter Mackimer, Lindley Darden, and Carl Craver. They all had their own specific ideas and nuances, but they shared some core commitments about what a good scientific explanation looks like.
So at the heart of this new mechanism approach, what's the main insight that ties all these thinkers together? What are they saying about how we should think about scientific explanation?
Their big insight is that mechanisms are fundamental to explanation. They see these mechanisms as organized systems of parts, and those parts interact causally to produce some phenomena we want to understand. It's about understanding how the individual pieces work together to create the overall behavior.
So it's like explaining how a bicycle works by showing how the pedals turn the gears, which moves the chain and then turns the wheel. You're detailing the parts and their interactions to explain the overall function.
Exactly. A perfect analogy.
Now, you mentioned that the individual components of a mechanism interact causally, which is that etiological aspect we talked about earlier. But how do the new mechanists think about the relationship between those individual parts and the mechanism as a whole?
Right. So the new mechanists generally see this relationship between the parts and the whole mechanism as a part-whole or constitutive relationship. Think of it this way. The whole is made up of its parts, and those parts, when arranged and interacting in a specific way, constitute the whole.
Okay, so like how all the proteins and molecules in a cell, when they interact in a certain way, make up the cell itself, right? Or how different areas of the brain work together to make up memory.
Exactly. And a really important point here is that these constitutive relationships aren't typically thought of as causal in the traditional sense. The idea is that the cell is its parts. Memory is those brain processes working together.
Okay, that's interesting. So we have these lower level components that have causal relationships with each other, and then those lower level components together constitute the higher level mechanism, which then produces the overall behavior we're trying to explain. Is there something reductive about this approach?
Yeah, you're right to pick up on that. Mechanistic explanation does have a kind of reductive character to it. The behavior of the whole mechanism is ultimately explained by breaking it down into the causal interactions of its smaller parts.
Like those diagrams in biology textbooks showing different levels of organization with arrows, indicating how things at one level contribute to the next, like atoms to molecules, molecules to cells, cells to tissues, and so on.
Exactly. Now, earlier you mentioned those etiological relationships between the components of a mechanism, and these relationships are super important for mechanistic explanation.
Okay, remind me why they are so important.
Well, the parts have to be organized and interact in a very specific way for the mechanism to actually work and produce the effect.
So it's not just about having the right parts. It's about how those parts are arranged and how they interact with each other, like the specific sequence of steps in a chemical reaction.
Right. And that interaction has to be very precise. It has to happen in the right order with the right timing and often in the right spatial arrangement. It all matters.
Now, explaining a mechanism often involves identifying what are called mediating factors. What exactly are those, and why are they important for this kind of explanation?
Great question. Mediating factors are those intermediate steps, the things that happen causally and often physically between the initial input to the mechanism and its final output, like the links in a chain.
So, like when a signal arrives at a nerve ending, that triggers the release of neurotransmitters, which then bind to receptors on another neuron. That binding triggers a new electrical signal. We're tracing that step-by-step process within the nervous system.
You got it. That's a great example of a mechanistic explanation involving mediating factors. Now, here's where things get interesting philosophically. There's debate among mechanists about just how much detail a mechanistic explanation needs to provide to be a good explanation. Some argue that it can be very abstract or leave out a lot of the fine-grained details and still be explanatory.
But I have a feeling the new mechanists generally favor more detail.
You're right. More commonly, the claim is that a good explanation needs to contain significant detail, maybe even as much detail as possible to really paint a complete picture of how the mechanism works. The idea is that simply knowing that one thing causes another isn't enough. You need to know how. You need to know the mechanism.
Right, like knowing that a gene is linked to a higher risk of a disease doesn't fully explain how that gene actually contributes to the disease. You'd want to know what's happening at the molecular level to really understand the connection.
Exactly. And some philosophers of mechanism, like Carl Craver, they take this idea even further. He argues that even models that give you a lot of anatomical and causal information can still be incomplete as explanations if they don't specify the mechanisms that are responsible for the behavior.
Like they provide a framework, but not all the details.
Right. Craver famously critiqued the Hodgkin-Huxley model of the action potential, which is a really important model in neuroscience because while it described the electrical changes in the neuron's membrane, it didn't explain the molecular mechanisms that cause the ion channels to open and close.
So for Craver, it was like a sketch. It gave you the outlines, but not all the important details.
Precisely. And Stuart Glennon has echoed that sentiment, calling a basic cause and effect relationship a sketchy mechanism sketch. But not everyone agrees that you always need tons of detail. Some philosophers argue that in some situations, leaving out detail can make an explanation better.
How so? Why would less detail sometimes be better for explaining something?
Well, they argue that sometimes too much detail just muddies the waters. It makes the explanation too complicated and hard to understand without really adding anything important. You want the right level of abstraction depending on what you're trying to explain.
It's about finding the sweet spot between too much and too little information.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, since mechanisms are all about these causal interactions between their parts, how do the new mechanists think about the concept of causation itself? Do they all agree on what it means for one thing to cause another?
That's another place where you see some philosophical disagreement among them. Some mechanists try to bring in existing philosophical accounts of causation to fit into their framework.
So are they like borrowing ideas about what causation is from other areas of philosophy?
Exactly.
Hmm.
For example, Carl Craver uses some elements of James Woodward's interventionist theory of causation, which we'll be talking about more later.
So they're building on other philosophical work to try to solidify their own ideas about causation.
Right. But then you have Stuart Glennon, who takes a different approach. He argues that the idea of a mechanism is actually more basic than our general concept of causation.
So he's saying that mechanisms are kind of like the building blocks of causation, and we can define causation by referring to mechanisms.
Yeah, he suggests that we should understand causation in terms of mechanism.
So like X causes Y if there's a mechanism that connects X and Y. Makes sense, but I imagine that raises some philosophical questions.
For sure. You'd need to explain what a mechanism is without using the concept of causation to avoid circular reasoning. It's a bit tricky. Then there's another view that comes from the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe. And this view is championed by philosophers like Peter McHammer, Lindley Darden, and Carl Craver. They actually avoid appealing to any general theory of causation at all.
So they're kind of saying, forget the big picture of causation. Let's just focus on how these mechanisms actually work.
Right. They're saying let's look at the specific causal processes that are happening within mechanisms.
So instead of trying to define this big abstract idea of causation, they're looking at the specific actions and interactions within a mechanism.
Exactly. They argue that trying to force all of these diverse ways things interact into a single definition of causation just isn't very useful for understanding how mechanisms actually work.
That's a fair point. Maybe a more nuanced view of causation is needed when you're dealing with the complexities of real-world mechanisms.
Now, another question that comes up with these mechanistic explanations is, how far can you really stretch this idea? We've been talking mostly about biology, but are all explanations in the life sciences mechanistic?
That seems like a pretty bold statement, right?
It is, and there's definitely some philosophical debate about it.
So what are the counter-arguments? Why might some explanations in biology not fit this mechanistic model?
Some argue that there are types of explanations in biology that don't neatly fit into the mechanistic mold. Maybe explanations that focus on how biological networks are organized or how complex systems change over time, or even computational models in neuroscience, which operate at a higher level of abstraction than detailed biological mechanisms.
So the debate is about where the boundaries of this idea of mechanism lie. How much can you stretch the definition before it becomes too broad and loses its meaning?
Exactly. And that leads to another related question.
Hmm.
Are there any types of causal explanation in science that are definitely not mechanistic in the way the new mechanists define it? And that depends on how narrowly or broadly you define a mechanism.
Right, because if you stick to the core idea of parts and their causal interactions, it seems like some causal explanations might not fit that. Like those involving large-scale causal pathways, like those found in ecosystems, those might not have easily identifiable parts in the same way that a machine does.
That's the worry, yeah.
So it's possible that this idea of mechanism, as defined by the new mechanists, might not be big enough to encompass all the ways we explain things causally in science.
Right, and this problem just gets bigger when you consider how the word mechanism is used in different scientific disciplines. You hear it in chemistry, physics, economics, even when people talk about evolution and natural selection.
So the question is, do all those uses have enough in common that a single philosophical theory can adequately cover all of them?
Exactly. It's a big question.
Okay, so the new mechanists have given us a really useful way of looking at scientific explanation, especially in biology. But there are still some open questions about how far this approach can really go and how it fits into our understanding of causation more generally.
For sure.
Well, let's shift gears now and look at the second big idea we wanted to cover, the chaotic account of explanation, which was developed by Michael Strevens.
All right. Stravins's theory is interesting because he presents it as a two-factor account of causal explanation. And the first factor is something he calls causal influence, which is basically his term for fundamental physical causation.
So he's starting with the most basic level of cause and effect in the physical world.
Yeah, but what's interesting about his approach is that he doesn't actually try to nail down what that fundamental physical causation is.
So he's not trying to solve that ultimate mystery of causation at the deepest level.
Right. He leaves that open to interpretation. He suggests that different philosophical ideas about causation, whether it's based on conserved quantities, counterfactuals, or interventions, could all potentially provide the groundwork for his theory.
So he's saying, look, we can have different ideas about what causation really is at the fundamental level, but here's how we can still build a theory of causal explanation on top of that.
You got it. He's taking this basic idea of causal influence as a starting point and then building from there.
That makes sense. Avoid those big debates about the nature of causation itself and focus on the explanation part. So how does that lead to his theory of explanation?
Well, that leads us to his second factor, causal explanation. For Strevens, a causal explanation is one that brings together all those causal influences that make a difference to whether or not something happens what he calls explanatory relevance.
So it's about picking out those causes that really matter for the thing you're trying to explain.
Exactly. It's not just any cause. It's the ones that make a real difference.
Okay, I'm following. So how do we figure out which causes are explanatorily relevant? What's the process?
Well, here Strevens introduces this important concept of causal entailment.
Causal entailment. Okay.
What's that? Think of it like a logical chain of reasoning. It happens when you have a set of true statements, and those statements logically lead to the conclusion that the event you're trying to explain had to happen. But it's not just any logical connection. Those statements have to reflect the actual chain of causes and effects in the real world.
So it's about finding the causal story that logically explains the event, but the story has to be grounded in the actual causal processes that took place.
Exactly. It's about the structure of the explanation mirroring the structure of the causal chain. But Strevens says that this mirroring by itself isn't enough for a good explanation. You have to take it a step further with something he calls abstraction.
Okay, extraction. So we're removing some layers, simplifying things.
Exactly. You start by getting rid of any statements in your explanation that aren't strictly necessary to still logically lead to the event.
So we're like trimming the fat, getting down to the bare bones of what truly explains the event.
You got it. The goal is to isolate the factors that really matter for the outcome, the ones that make a real difference. What you're left with after this abstraction process is what Strevens calls a standalone explanation.
A standalone explanation. I like that. So we're getting rid of all the fluff and getting down to the core of what explains why something happened.
Right. And Strevens emphasizes that a standalone explanation isn't just about counterfactual dependence or statistical correlations, although those can be helpful clues. It's about figuring out the minimum you need in your causal story to explain the event, while still satisfying this other constraint that we'll talk about in a minute.
Okay, interesting. So give me an example. How does this abstraction process work in a real-world explanation?
Okay, let's think about a window shattering. The physics behind that at a really detailed level is crazy complicated. You have all these forces and interactions at the microscopic level. But if you're trying to explain why the window shattered, you don't need all those tiny details.
You can just say something, hit it with enough force, right?
Right. You can abstract away from those super detailed physical processes
Yeah.
and still have a set of statements that causally entails the shattering. The standalone explanation is what's left after you've gotten rid of all the extra detail that doesn't really matter for the explanation.
Okay, that makes sense. So we figured out what makes a cause explanatorily relevant and how we can abstract away from unnecessary details. But Stravens also points out that sometimes you can have different causal scenarios that lead to the same effect.
Right.
Like a window could be shattered by a rock, but also by a sonic boom. So how does his theory deal with these different ways of causing the same outcome? What makes one way of causing it a better explanation than another?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's where he brings in this really important idea of cohesion. He's basically saying you can't just list a bunch of totally different ways of causing the same effect, even if weakening your statements to include all of them would still let you logically derive the effect.
So a rock and a sonic boom, even though they can both shatter a window, aren't cohesive in this sense.
Right. He says there has to be some kind of connection or continuity between the different ways of causing the same effect. They have to be, as he puts it, causally contiguous from the perspective of fundamental physics.
Causally contiguous. So like you could trace a continuous chain of cause and effect at the most basic physical level, from the rock to the shattering and from the sonic boom to the shattering.
Exactly. So a sonic boom and a rock, while both capable of shattering a window, wouldn't be considered cohesive because they're not causally contiguous at that fundamental physical level. And for Stravens, fundamental physics acts as the ultimate judge of whether different ways of causing the same thing are similar enough to count as a good explanation, at least for those deep, fundamental standalone explanations.
So fundamental physics is like the referee deciding which explanations are in and which are out. That's a pretty big role for physics to play in determining what counts as a good explanation in other areas of science.
It is, and that's something a lot of philosophers have discussed and debated.
Makes sense. It's like saying that the deeper reasons for why things happen ultimately come down to those fundamental physical processes. But wouldn't that make explaining things in fields like biology or psychology super complex? Would we always have to trace everything back to those fundamental physical interactions?
It's definitely a challenge, and it raises a lot of interesting questions about how different levels of explanation relate to each other. But Stravens argues that this connection to fundamental physics is actually a strength of his account.
How so?
Well, he says it lets him separate these really difficult metaphysical questions about what causation actually is at the most basic level from the more practical questions about what makes for a good causal explanation in different areas of science.
So he's saying, let's not get bogged down in the deep philosophical debates about causation itself. Let's focus on how we actually use causal explanations in science.
Exactly. And he argues that lots of the causal claims we make in everyday life and even in science, especially when we're not talking about fundamental physics, are actually claims about explanatory relevance, not directly about fundamental causation.
So when a doctor says that a certain medication relieves headaches, they're not necessarily making a claim about the fundamental nature of causation. They're making a claim about what's explanatorily relevant for understanding how that medication works, even if they don't know the underlying mechanisms at a super detailed level.
Right. Now, this idea of cohesion seems like it might be tricky to apply when you have explanations that seem to apply to very different things.
Right, because if you need everything to be causally contiguous at the level of physics, it seems like that would rule out a lot of scientific explanations that we consider to be good, like the theory of natural selection, which applies to so many different kinds of organisms with completely different physical makeups.
You're hitting on a key point. How can you have a single explanation that covers such a vast range of physically diverse things if everything has to be causally contiguous at the fundamental level?
Right, because a bacteria and a blue whale are very different at the physical level, but we still use the same principles of natural selection to explain how they evolved.
Exactly. And Stravens addresses this by introducing this idea of a framework.
A framework, what's that?
A framework is basically a set of background assumptions or conditions that you take for granted in an explanation. You don't have to spell them out every time. It's kind of like treating some aspects of the causal story as a black box. You don't need to open up that box and explain everything inside it at that particular level.
So it's like when we talk about how a computer works, we don't usually need to go into the physics of how the transistors work at the atomic level, right? We can just treat the transistor as a component that does a certain thing without worrying about the deeper physical details.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Stravens would say that those frameworked explanations are perfectly fine for many scientific purposes. But he'd also argue that you could, in principle, deepen those explanations by unpacking those black boxes and showing how they also satisfy the cohesion requirement at a lower level.
So frameworks let you kind of zoom in or zoom out on different levels of detail depending on what you're trying to explain.
Right. It's about finding the right level of explanation for the question at hand.
Now, you said earlier that Strevens describes his account as descriptive, meaning that it's trying to capture how we actually use and think about explanations.
Right.
But it seems like there's also a bit of a normative aspect to it, too. It's kind of like saying, this is how good explanations should work.
You picked up on that too. He seems to be suggesting that our intuitions about good explanations are actually tracking these underlying physical constraints, even if we're not always consciously aware of those connections. And if an explanation doesn't fit these constraints, then it's not as good as it could be.
So he's not just describing how we use explanations, but also suggesting a way to evaluate them and say which ones are better than others.
Right. Now, another thing that comes up a lot in science is that we use what are called idealizations in explanations.
Idealization.
Idealizations are basically simplifications or assumptions that we know aren't perfectly true, but we use them to make the explanations easier to work with.
Like assuming that a surface is perfectly frictionless in a physics problem, even though no real surface is perfectly frictionless.
Exactly. And Strevens argues that these idealizations, even if they involve statements that are technically false, don't ruin an explanation as long as those idealized features aren't difference makers according to his abstraction procedure. In fact, he suggests that idealizations can actually be good because they help us focus on the factors that do matter.
It's like highlighting the key players in the causal story and ignoring the minor characters.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, Strevens' theory has sparked a lot of debate among philosophers. One of the biggest points of contention is his assumption that all explanations have to be causal at some level.
Right, because there's been a lot of interest lately in explanations that don't rely on causation.
Exactly. We'll be exploring those non-causal explanations in a bit, but it's important to note that Strevens' theory is firmly planted in the world of causal explanation.
And I imagine some philosophers have also questioned his reliance on fundamental physics as the ultimate arbiter of what counts as a good causal explanation.
Yes, absolutely. Some argue that the fundamental relationships in physics might not actually align with our usual ideas about causation at the higher levels.
Mhm.
Maybe they don't have a clear direction or asymmetry like we normally think of with cause and effect.
So they're questioning whether physics is the right foundation for a theory of explanation.
Yeah, and there have been some criticisms of the abstraction process itself.
Okay, so what are some of the issues people have raised?
Well, for one thing, the cohesion requirement has been criticized for being a bit vague and hard to apply in practice. How exactly do we figure out what counts as causally contiguous from the perspective of fundamental physics, especially when you're dealing with systems that have lots of different levels of organization, like those in biology?
Right. I can imagine that would get tricky fast. And you also mentioned that some explanations seem to apply to a whole bunch of different systems, but those systems don't necessarily seem causally contiguous at that deep level.
Yeah, like those Locke-Volterra equations we talked about earlier, which describe how predator and prey populations change over time.
Right, and those equations are applied to all kinds of different ecosystems with different types of organisms.
Exactly. And some philosophers think that Strevens' theory, even with this idea of frameworks, doesn't really account for the success and explanatory power of those kinds of explanations.
Makes sense. And what about those examples of universal behavior in physics where you see the same patterns in very different systems?
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Those are often explained using what's called renormalization group techniques, which basically let you ignore a lot of the specific details and focus on the large-scale patterns.
And it's not clear how those techniques fit with this idea of everything needing to be causally contiguous at the fundamental level.
Right. Some philosophers would even argue that those renormalization group explanations are actually a good example of non-causal explanation, because they show that the fine-grained details just don't matter for the outcome. Of course, Strevens would probably say that if the input to that renormalization process involves causal influences, then the explanation is still causal, even if it's very abstract.
So it all comes down to how you interpret these different mathematical techniques and whether you see them as ultimately relying on causal relationships or not.
Exactly.
Now, even if we accept this whole idea of cohesion in principle, how are we supposed to judge whether it's actually being met in practice? Most of us don't have a deep understanding of fundamental physics, so how are we supposed to know if the cohesion requirement is satisfied?
Yeah, that's another challenge for his view. It raises questions about how accessible and applicable this account really is for people who aren't experts in fundamental physics.
But despite these debates, I think Streven's work has brought up a really important point that we often have this intuition that when we see similar patterns in very different systems, there's probably a deeper explanation for that similarity.
Totally. And figuring out those deeper explanations is often what drives scientific progress, whether those explanations ultimately rely on causal contiguity or not.
Okay, we've spent quite a bit of time with mechanisms and the kinetic account. Let's move on to that third big idea, interventionist theories of explanation.
Okay, so interventionist theories actually offer an account of both causation and explanation.
So they're trying to tackle both of those big philosophical questions at once.
Right. They're kind of a two-for-one deal.
And I remember from the SEP entry you mentioned that they really dive deep into causation. But we're going to focus more on the explanation side for now.
Sounds good.
So, refresh my memory. What's the basic idea behind interventionism? How do they define causation?
They say that for one thing to cause another, you have to be able to imagine a situation where if you change the first thing in a specific way, the second thing also changes. And that change has to happen solely because of the change you made to the first thing. There can't be any other factors messing things up.
Okay, and that specific kind of manipulation is what they call an intervention, right?
Right. It's not just any change. It has to be a change that isolates the effect of the cause you're interested in.